There's no single theory of how people are radicalized and therefore how to de-radicalize individuals. So you can't take a blanket approach and apply it to everybody in the space. So when looking at a question like de-radicalization, essentially what we found in our efforts over several years, and we've dealt with probably almost 100 cases of individuals who've been various parts of that spectrum, that actually you have to define what it is you're dealing with first, and then you can start looking at actually what are the issues that you need to tackle and how do you measure the change in that individual. So with some, actually what you're talking about, what people like to prefer to use as disengagement. You want them to no longer support violence or take part in violence, and that's the key goal, and that's all that can be achieved with those individuals. So maybe they have political reasons, maybe they have a blend of ideology, which is some sort of notions of good and bad, and the West versus, what's happening in the world. If they're Islamists, then the West versus Muslims and Islam, in this kind of binary perspective. They see the immoral or the, evil nature of Western governments and powers, etc. And from there it moves to then deciding, after they've dehumanized the other, that violence is a legitimate means towards achieving certain goals. In that circumstance and situation, you may want to tackle some of the underpinning psychology as well. You may want to tackle the dehumanizing of the other. You may want to tackle the simplistic binary political narrative. You may want to take out the alleged religious justifications for these things. And if all of those factors are looked at, you may well be able to say, actually, there is a change in the engagement of that individual with extreme ideas or ideology or causes, in the motivation of that individual to undertake these acts or to justify these acts, and the means by which they're going to do so. So in that sense, you can then talk about actually not just disengagement, but actually de-radicalization, or removing away the kind of psychological, intellectual motivations for that individual, and why they would consider violence a legitimate option. One of the things that's very, very key now, especially with the rise of the so-called Islamic State, ISIS, Daesh in Syria and Iraq, is the very strong ideo-political element, that we have a duty, an obligation to support the burgeoning Islamic State, this caliphate. Actually, we've had people, whether it's Al-Qaeda that spoke about the restoration of Sharia and the caliphate from Spain to Indonesia, etc. We found people like Ayman Zawahiri often speaking of these things. More radical groups which don't engage in violence but describe the utopian caliphate system have spread that ideology quite strongly. So now we actually have not just an idea of it, but we have a real manifestation of a caliphate in Syria and Iraq. So it's no longer just something people talk about, it's there. And so the pull of a real Islamic state, or so-called Islamist state, is one that is a strong brand for people to go to. So now we have this utopia. There are no longer the borders between Syria and Iraq. It doesn't exist anymore. We've established a state which doesn't recognize the imperial borders that are imposed upon us. We have now no longer an elected leader or a Western-inspired leader. We have a true Islamic leader, a caliph. We have the Sharia law being implemented. We have a jihad going on which is fighting both the agents in the Muslim majority countries in terms of governments, and also the Western powers who are fighting them. So actually you have a real life caliphate and jihad which people have spoken about but actually taking place now. Therefore that brand is very, very powerful. And hence the ideological drive is very, very strong. And the appeal to young people who arguably are, in a situation where they have been brought up around this us and them narrative. They hear it about the West and about the Muslims, about the kuffar and about the people of faith, about looking at the hegemony of capitalism and we need an alternative. This narrative has been imbued for many, many years. And actually, when they now see it playing out, and they see people telling them, come to the Islamic State, we have a true Islamic economy, we have a welfare system which is Islamic, we have even a health service which is run under Islamic guidelines, we have an education system where we teach true Islam to people, and we have this state, this utopian idealistic state, that is actually where you can live your Islamic identity and live by the Islamic rules and regulations, where we segregate men and women in society, where we impose Sharia punishments on people that violate those key things, where we are actually living a true, perfect Islamic life. And when you attach that to individuals who may well have a sense of lack of belonging to wider society, they may well have a lack of well-integration and identity issues where they don't fully, for whatever reasons, political or not political, for whatever reasons they do not fully integrate and identify themselves with the society they're from, that psychological state can easily be manipulated. Coupled with the ideology, it's a very strong driving force. In tackling it, you have to do two things. You have to separate out what the specific cause is for the individuals. What is it that attracts those individuals? So for some it will be actually an understanding of religious ideology. And then what you need to do is unpack that understanding of religious ideology. So the approach we take is actually, because we live, essentially, Britain may well be a Christian state, but it's a secularized state. Parliament functions, theoretically without Queen and Church interference. It is, we have a liberal perspective on how we build our laws, it's democratic, etc. So we shouldn't really be interfering in the religion of individuals. However, in any type of intervention, we will try and challenge the narrative, which is skewed. And so we will take apart and question and take a kind of Socratic approach where we dismantle the religious foundations of this ideology. So tackling things like the notion of the West being an alien land to Islam and Muslims, both historically and religiously, that actually Muslims have the ability to practice their faith in most countries. They have the ability to express their religiosity without persecution. This, religiously speaking, means that this isn't a hostile land to Muslims and Islam, and that their narrative is actually not orthodox religion, but it's actually very, very unorthodox. It's a modern heresy. Similarly, as an example, ISIS will talk about, one of their books is called The Management of Savagery. It's by Abu Bakr al-Naji. He speaks about how modern guerrilla warfare is almost a universal science and doesn't require religiosity, but just requires understanding that the power of savagery and brutality. And actually being able to take that apart and demonstrate both on a modern level that's not true. We have all sorts of Geneva Conventions, we have all sorts of laws, we have all sorts of international courts, but also religiously speaking, that may well be a trend amongst guerrilla warfare, but it violates classical consensus. So we're not talking about changing the religion, we're just talking about have you actually understood the foundations of your religiosity. Because Jasad Bello and Jassam Bello in classical conceptions of warfare and jihad were always the right authority fighting the right cause and not fighting and killing civilians, women, children, etc. So even on a medieval level, actually the underpinning, it's actually very modern as opposed to medieval. And then tackling also the other issues, the concept of caliphate. A lot of the things here when people speak about this stuff, looking at it historically, the Caliphate was a massively diverse empire, and many different empires, whether the Umayyads in Spain, or the Abbasids, or the Fatimids, or the Ottomans, or the Safavids across Iran. Actually, they were very, very different. The empires were not homogeneous singular states. This is the age of empire, where people had various different religious enclaves. As an example, the Ottomans towards the end, they had all sorts of laws, often borrowed from the French and the Dutch, which they saw as religiously acceptable. And a lot of these extreme groups still describe the Ottomans as a caliphate. And so you start to break the narrative of kind of singular superstate. And religiously you can easily do this by looking at the fact that, there's a saying, if you get 2 Jews, you'll get 3 opinions. And it's the same with Muslims. They have a variety of traditions and religions which all root back to Scripture. And so once you demonstrate that, it becomes difficult to reconcile totalitarianism and absolutism with a religious tradition that's massively diverse. But then walking that landscape and being able to demonstrate that is important. Because for some people, it's nothing to do with the religion primarily, it's the politics.